Hi there, welcome to the Dylan Rounds case and what we now know of as for the recent breaking news. Today I want to put into perspective via the usage of maps and the day of the 28th. We already know the location of Dylan's burial site, roughly speaking, videos coverage on that previously, and just recently as well, video coverage on Candice Cooley revealing the motive of why James Brenner did what he did to Dylan Rounds. If you'd like to catch up on videos like that before watching this or after watching this video, top right corner of the screen where the I symbol is, you click on that and you'll be able to find and catch up there. Welcome to those that are currently hearing this live premiere right now. Feel free to share your thoughts and opinions, reactions in the live chat box right inside of the screen. And for those that just want to leave comments, reactions in general, let me know your thoughts under this video in the comment section and I'll look over them at a later point. You'll also find a pinned comment by me with some additional links. Feel free to check them out. If you want to support the channel in alternative ways, there are means to do so and it's available. Appreciate the people that have supported the channel recently and as well as gifted memberships as well. That's good to see. I also did a live stream last night, just a bit of a casual one. A little bit disappointing, a little bit flat, but kind of just confirms, reinforces why I don't bother doing them too often, and it's not worth sacrificing my sleep and time and health related stuff. It's not worth it. So stick to these normal based videos in a live premiere format. And today, looking at what we do know, what has been confirmed, and still there are some questions which we can highlight today, possibly a little bit of uncertainty. That's the best way of wording it. And I'll try and stick with appropriate language today and not create the same mistakes other humans have made with time. So when it comes to James Brenner, the murderer, charged with second-degree murder of Dylan Rounds and pled guilty to that, and as well responsible for the desecration of Dylan Rounds, though the charge has been dropped on that because of the plea deal. Details and backstory behind that is on my channel if you want to catch up on it recently. It's all there. Feel free to check it out when you can. But as for the cause of death of Dylan Rounds, that was revealed, confirmed officially. So an autopsy would have been done. Dylan Rounds was shot in the skull multiple times. So that pretty much indicates that Brenner shot Dylan. And, for some time, that's what I was thinking and highlighting, and some others were. There was a range of others, though, that were obsessed with other means of killing and being chopped. Obviously, that was a load of bollocks. But in terms of Brenner shooting Dylan multiple times, yeah, it wasn't by any accident. You don't accidentally shoot someone multiple times in the head, right? Right. So that pretty much confirmed that. As for the location, where exactly did it happen? Near to the grain shed or inside the grain shed? That hasn't been revealed yet, but it's going to be on the grain shed property because that's where Dylan Rounds' phone was at and where it pinged at. And around 7:03 is probably when he was last alive and when he managed to make it down to the grain shed in his grain truck, and then whatever happened, happened. And when we say whatever happened, along the basis of, was it inside or outside of the grain shed? Was it a direct ambush or a bit of confrontation? Details like that, pieces along the way, will help create that full story. Bits and bobs like that may be revealed at a later point, but it would have to come from Brenner, as he's the witness in a way. He's the one that saw it, he's the one that did it. Dylan Rounds isn't around to talk. There was no one else on site at the time from how it's been worded, so you haven't got any alternative witnesses. The interesting point to me is, whilst Lucin is described as a ghost town with a very, very low population, with time I kept hearing about more and more people living out there in trailers, spread out, farm handlers, ranchers, whatever, random people I've never heard of before, strangers. And I think, oh, so it's not that quiet. My question is, how come no one heard any gunshots? I mean, if the gunshots were fired inside of the grain shed, would that have concealed the sound slightly? Though if it was outside and there was a bit of breeze or wind, that could cause the sound to travel further distance to more people around here. There was some points made by people saying how, well, there were any gunshots, it wouldn't be a surprise to anyone because it could be hunters, wildlife being killed, a warning shot of an animal, wild animal, an attack of an animal, shooting. It's not out of the ordinary. Though if you're in an urban area where you don't get people casually walking around with guns often or people being shot when you do hear it, probably more likely to panic and be concerned. So that kind of excuses why people didn't react to those gunshots. But my question is, did anyone hear the gunshots? They don't have to recognise it as something shady or there's foul play going on at the time, okay? As for the lack of reaction, well, I'd understand immediately the lack of reaction because they may think it's nothing. It's normal day activity of shooting things, shooting targets, shooting in the air. If that's what they do, the locals will be used to those sounds, familiar with. But if then there came a story, the breaking news of Dylan Rounds, of what happened to him, and more evidence came out along the way, why have no locals reached out ever since? And even recently, we're hearing about the cause of death, that Dylan Rounds was shot multiple times. Why haven't any locals thought, you know what? Yeah, I remember hearing multiple gunshots on that day. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I understand. Why has no one reached out there with any additional, or is it just simply because no one actually heard it? Okay, you can hear sounds, don't mean to say you're going to report on it if you don't think there's anything wrong with it. But then at a later point, if then you find out it was related to something bad going on, I'm just surprised no one's come forwards and said, oh yeah, I remember that back then. It's not happened. So that's a little bit of an unanswered question there, right? The location, inside or outside of the grain shed, that's a question, right? Is there any more questions? Kind of a question because there's not enough certainty behind it. It's not reinforced enough to do with the firearm. Okay, Brenner shot Dylan, but with what firearm? Brenner's own firearm or Dylan's? And it's leaning in the direction of Dylan's firearm, right? The other question would be, if it's not Dylan's, was it ever found? And this is the thing. We might as well just highlight it right now before I forget. If it wasn't Dylan Rounds' firearm and it was another person's, there's not been any talk, has there, regarding the murder weapon being found. They've revealed who killed Dylan and how he killed Dylan, James Brenner, but no confirmation of the murder weapon being found. Maybe it might have been in the background, it's not been revealed yet publicly. That's all I can think of. If not, is it buried somewhere? Has it been disposed of well? Would anyone ever search for it, or is it not necessary anymore? Now, on the basis that it was Dylan Rounds' firearm in that time-lapse footage, how does the time-lapse footage come into play here? Well, we can get to that shortly. I do have a few slides and photos we can narrate over instead of just me talking here, so you can actually visualize it yourself. But in terms of a time-lapse footage, whatever firearm that was being cleaned in that footage, I didn't see the parents or anyone bring it up saying, oh, that's Dylan's firearm. So then does that counter the original point about Brenner using a gun against Dylan? Some people could ask, well, how? Two separate things, right? Not quite, because they do follow one after the other. What we'll do now, we'll transition onto the photos and slides whilst I continue this story and whilst we analyse the situation. And possibly I could go onto the maps as well later to do my final points. But in terms of mapping and aerial imagery, besides the typical Google Earth, you do have the aerial imagery from Heavy D when they did the flyby over. So it is a bit more zoomed in, but it's kind of the equivalent of Google Earth bird's eye view, but almost 2.5D. Or 3D rendered, so you can actually see the imagery and Brenner's trailer as well. So then when I'm narrating, you can see which key spot we're looking at. Let's head on over now. Here is the photo, one of which, there's the other one, the grain shed property. But we do have two more sections here which need to be acknowledged. This is just the additional confirmation, despite what I've said, how we saw it officially in the news about authorities confirming Dylan was shot after a dispute on the property they own. Now, when I read it elsewhere, it said like a work dispute, and that would make more sense. A dispute is a dispute. But it's a bit weird. Dispute on the property they own. No. Because Dylan Rounds doesn't own the Grainshed property. James Brenner doesn't exactly own the Grainshed property. So it's been worded poorly here. But the bit about authorities confirming Dylan being shot is true, has been confirmed. And if you're not convinced by it, the official court appearance of Brenner mentions it there as well officially. So that's one thing that's been consistent since hearing about it, which is positive news in a way. The bit above it though, Candice Cooley revealed Brenner was trying to spin an off-the-wall crazy story in a sick attempt to claim his innocence. What was that all about? Desperation from Brenner? Why did he not show that level of desperation early on in the case then just recent? I don't understand that point. It's a shame Candice Cooley never explained what Brenner was actually referring to claim his innocence. What was the elaborate story he came up with? Never mind. This here is actually a response from one of my questions on a community post page on my channel where I was saying how, so I heard recently that people were talking about Brenner using a firearm, which was Dylan Rounds using it against him to kill him. So we know Dylan Rounds got shot, but what firearm was used? And some people were highlighting it was Dylan's. Weezer added in recently saying, I added it in chat, but maybe I was too late. I was told about 1 month ago from a guy that is friends with Justin. He also told me about the 2 shots being the cause of death. Interesting. So Weezer has been consistent and cooperative within the Dylan Rounds case, which is good to see. So yeah, it's like, well, from what he said, but there is a level of consistency here, so you can probably trust it better than other sources. So it's a guy, whoever that guy is, that just so happens to be friends with Justin Rounds. Now people could say, yeah, but do they know for sure? Well, they also knew that Dylan was shot 2 times, and that was a month ago, being the cause of death. But to be honest, 1 month ago, what are we now? We're in May. April, 9th of April is when Dylan Rounds was found, when the plea deal occurred with Brenner, when Brenner led authorities out there. So it does timeline this. It does, to be honest. You think about a month ago or so, close to that, when Dylan Rounds' body was found in that burial site, would have led to an autopsy report because of the identification confirming it was Dylan. Hearing about the cause of death privately in the background back then, and then it only being revealed to the public in the public court appearance of Brenner on May 15th. So, to be honest, yeah, I'd say that's consistent, okay? The bit about, this guy who's friends with Justin, knowing about Dylan being shot at least 2 times, as for the cause of death, a month ago, around the time of when Dylan's body was found, recovered, identified, and an autopsy was likely done. And then we heard about it publicly a month later. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So that's consistent there. So maybe it's also consistent about, the gun being used against Dylan. Now, I know it doesn't mention it here in Weezer's comment, but if you go back to my community page, my community tab, I asked the question regarding where's the providence, where's the source that Brenner used Dylan's firearm against him? And Weezer said a person that knows Justin mentioned it. So maybe they do know more. My only question would be, whilst the cause of death was revealed publicly, why wasn't the actual firearm revealed as to whether it's been found, recovered, or it hasn't? Now, as I said, if it's on the basis of Dylan's firearm, well, technically it was returned. We'll get to that a bit later. But we just look at this image right now. I do genuinely find it better and easier to narrate when I'm actually looking at something relevant, right, to the events that followed. Granted, satellite imagery, very useful when looking at routes, potential locations and spots, and looking at the confirmed hits. But this really does put into perspective. This is the closest to boots on ground. Well, maybe not quite because it's in the air, but you get the idea, okay? This footage was taken really early on in the case, right? Maybe the first week or two when Heavy D and the crew came out there to assist with Candice Cooley, the family. We zoom on in. Not everything what appears here is still there now, right? The grain truck is no longer there. Brenner's trailer, no longer there. And maybe some other vehicles as well, like that truck, no longer there. Last time I remember looking on satellite imagery, the backhoe was added to the spot because the property owner at the time, the original owner, wanted Kurt Wadsworth to take his backhoe from Dylan's farm to here for work to be done. Did it actually happen? I don't know. The dirt mound, though, does it actually show? I can't remember how far away it is. Maybe it's off the screen. I mean, when you look at Glorindellon's footage, you can see it, and that's on boots on ground. But how do we apply this image right now to what we were talking about? Well, 7:03 a.m. in the morning of the 28th of May 2022, Dylan Rounds' phone pings around here, near to the grain shed property. Likely because, just like in his position, Dylan Rounds in the grain truck attempting to reverse it into the shed. Now, there's been a few obsessed individuals like Corey, maybe some others, can't remember everyone's name, but was obsessing saying, this truck here, that wouldn't fit in the shed. I mean, when you look at it quick, the scale of it, yeah, it seems like the truck would fit in the shed. But even Candice Cooley said early on that the truck was peeping out, you know, the front part of it. It didn't quite fit in completely. Doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. As long as the trailer part, the back end, goes in and it's protected, that's all that matters. And that's what Dylan was attempting to do. Now, what about the actual inside of the grain shed property? Well, you see it here. That's the aerial viewpoint, right, of the grain shed. This is the inside viewpoint. I'm glad I got it in this order as well, so you get a first-hand look. This was on East Idaho News. Okay, I believe maybe Candice Cooley took this photo, not the soggy individual that says he's the only one that recorded the footage of the grain shed. That's incorrect. When looking on screen, you got that gate there. You see it on the right where that red tubing is dangling over it. You got that gate there. And then you got another gate on the left, which is kind of out of sight, but far left, propped up, and it's a bit bent and damaged. That appears to be the horse gate, which may have been going across the entranceway of the grain shed property. And if Dylan Rounds was reversing his grain truck into that entranceway, and it was gated off, unknown to Dylan, reversing into it, breaking the horse gate, causing a bit of damage, possibly Dylan Rounds stopping to get out of his truck to see what's happened, Brenner hearing the commotion and noise from his trailer here, getting on out, walking down to the grain shed to confront Dylan about it, and then having it out as for the dispute. But then how does that lead to Dylan being shot? Because one way or another, someone has to be in possession of a firearm. As we know, it's been confirmed Dylan Rounds was shot multiple times in the head, as the skull said so. When you look at Dylan's skull, as the authorities confirmed. With Weezer saying that Justin Rounds and a friend of Justin know about Brenner using a firearm of Dylan's against him, how would it apply here in the moment? How would Brenner use Dylan's firearm against Dylan? How did Brenner get a hold of it in the first place? Right, that's the question. From what we've heard in the past, when it comes to Dylan Rounds' farm, as you see on screen, this is Dylan's farm, 5 miles away from the grain shed property. This is east of the grain shed property. Not everything you see here still exists on the land now, so the 2 trailers no longer there. Dylan's pickup truck, Ford pickup truck, no longer there. And then maybe some other equipment lacking. And that's going to be taken away with time. It makes sense. But, as it was said by Candice Cooley, from what the mother said, that Dylan Rounds never locked his pickup truck and that he would keep his guns stored in his pickup truck. Now, if that was really the case and that occurred on the 28th, and if Dylan Rounds was at the Grangeshed property at the moment, at the timestamp he was going to be taken out, Brenner wouldn't be able to rush down to this location of Dylan's farm and then make it back to the Grangeshed property to then kill Dylan. That'd be very unrealistic and silly. So that's what was ruled out back then. But the alternative way of looking at it, and really the only way, would be on the day of the 28th, it just so happened that Dylan Rounds had the firearm on him when he was in his grain truck instead for possible protection, making his way to the Grangeshed property, passing Brenner's trailer here. Surely the noise itself may have woken up Brenner, possibly. I mean, earlier, before that, at 6:58 a.m, when Dylan Rounds was at the gate of the Grangeshed, which is further down that road back there, south, not too far down, Dylan attempted to call Brenner, but there was no answer, possibly because Brenner wasn't awake or just chose to ignore Dylan. It was early in the morning. I don't think Brenner wakes up early in the morning. So Dylan still made his way down. And if there was a bit of clattering and banging noises, that could have alerted and startled Brenner. If he was already in a bad mood, well, this is only going to throw him over the edge. Those factors you got to take into consideration. We did the motives recently as a standalone video. Check that out on my channel for further context there. Dylan Rounds at 7:03 a.m. Phone ping, still alive possibly. The next time that phone pinged was in Brenner's trailer there at 7:27 a.m. The time-lapse footage, which showed Brenner covered in blood. A shirt which had DNA of Dylan Rounds on it, later confirmed by police. Within that time-lapse footage, Brenner was seen cleaning a firearm. Justin Rounds, Candice Cooley confirmed that. They saw the footage themselves, right? Cleaning a firearm. At the time, I was suggesting, well, maybe Brenner is cleaning a firearm because it was just used before that, within that 30-minute period of Dylan making it down to the Grangeshed property, then being confronted in some way or another with James Brenner and Dylan being shot. As I said, I was one of the few to do a bit of a ballistic analysis, looking at the Grangeshed. For example, if it occurred inside, do we have any bullet holes? And most of them appeared natural. But because we know now that Dylan Rounds was shot multiple times, well, you could have possibly multiple holes. Though, because of the height you take in mind, and Dylan's been shot in the head, I don't think it's going to ricochet high up on the ceiling. It should be kind of lower down, as you see holes back there on the back-facing wall. But that's if it did occur inside. If it occurred on the outside, in the open, it may not hit anything and it could travel some distance. I don't know how far. Depends the distance on the firearms and exactly what type of firearm Dylan had. Some kind of handgun, what make, what model, what ammunition. I can't remember if it was mentioned, but yeah, there's that to take in mind, okay? So to refer back to the time-lapse footage, and with what we know of now, it being confirmed in recent time Dylan Rounds was shot multiple times by Brenner, isn't it a coincidence that just after the death of Dylan Rounds, Brenner is seen cleaning a firearm? Maybe Brenner cleaning that firearm because it was just used moments before when killing Dylan Rounds. Cleaning that firearm down, maybe because it had blood splatter on it if it was up close. Cleaning the firearm down because it had DNA and evidence of Brenner on it. Or maybe Dylan's, if it was Dylan's firearm, right? Normally, when you do get a killer and they may have used a murder weapon, they might dispose of it shortly afterwards, or they may just clean it down of evidence. Same with clothing. Now, Brenner failed to do that with the clothing, but appeared to be successful with cleaning the murder weapon of evidence. And you may wonder, well, why would it be successful? Because, at least from what we've heard of, there's not been any mention about a murder weapon being found. So how can you confirm that Dylan Rounds was shot then if you don't have a murder weapon? Well, you do that ballistic analysis report, you look at the autopsy report, and it shows bullet holes to the head, as they confirmed. So you don't need a firearm to prove that Dylan was shot, as long as the autopsy report is enough in evidence to say this is proof that Dylan was shot. Right? That's more than enough. I think most people would agree there. But what happened with the murder weapon? Where did it end up? If it was Brenner's own firearm, and the same one that was seen in the time-lapse footage, the murder weapon caught on camera, there's not been any mention of it being found. We didn't hear it recently, we've not heard it in the past. There's not been any mention of that. But on the basis that Brenner was using Dylan's firearm against him, that was technically found very early on then, on that basis. Because if we just go back to what we heard of in the past with Dylan Rounds' farm, when the family got down there, I believe on the 30th of May 2022, they were looking about at Dylan's farm first and foremost to look for clues, to look for Dylan Rounds, unsure as to what happened to him. When they got to Dylan's trailer, and more so the pickup truck, not the grain truck, but the pickup truck, Dylan's main vehicle from getting place to place, Justin Rounds broke the back window to gain access. He didn't find anything inside, so it was a bit of a waste of time, and it's, to an extent, evidence damaged, contaminated, but it is what it is now. Supposedly there was a sheriff or detective on site observing and allowing them to look about and allowing Justin to break entry. Ever since, the blame has kind of been shifted onto that detective or that sheriff for allowing it, but to be honest, it should be self-control as well from the family. Don't be touching everything just in case it's a part of a crime scene, but, heat of the moment, you're not going to think. I understand that as well. You could argue and say no one's to blame in that moment, but when you reflect back on it later, well, it's easy to point the finger. But what was the problem though, whilst the family was searching about here? Well, they noticed at some point that the gun and key fob of Dylan Rounds was missing. And besides the questions of was the pickup truck used in the murder or the desecration of Dylan Rounds, that till this day still remains a bit of a mystery because there's not been enough evidence to reinforce it. And from what we heard from that recent court appearance of Brenner, there was no mention of Dylan Rounds' pickup truck being used or Brenner being responsible for it. We may hear more details in the future, but that still remains a bit of a grey area. But focusing on 30th of May 2022, family could not locate the gun and key fob, wondered where it went, has it been taken? And then, fast forward onwards, going down to the grain shed property without actually looking too much in the grain shed, going to the dirt mound, which I think is off camera here, and coming across Dylan Rounds' boots. That's what hinted the foul play. That's where the worry and suspicion started growing, and then the questioning with Brenner and the contradictions and lies by him. Now that's going a bit too on into the story, but most of you will know up to a point of what happened, right? Ever since then, for maybe a few months or a year possibly, the endless tussle of what happened to the gun and key fob, who took it, who returned it. Because just to acknowledge, 30th of May 2022, family realised the gun and key fob's missing. 31st of May, they receive a call from Kurt Wadsworth, Montello local, influenced by his ex-girlfriend, with a false lead of Dylan being kidnapped, held hostage in Montello by Chase Venstra, Robert Aviles. Turned out to be a false lead, waste of time, but it did get the attention of the family and police. And then on the 1st and the 2nd of June, in whichever order the gun, then the key fob, or the other way around, were returned, one each day. 1st of June, 2nd of June. By the 2nd, both the gun and key fob was finally returned back inside of the trailer on a countertop, I believe. The false claims and misinformation came from Corey and was spread and reinforced by Bob Farrell, Fast Eddie, let's not forget that greasy-haired, bearded person. Fast Eddie was a catalyst in spreading misinformation. Corey, the main problem of misinformation. Bob Farrell, the enabler and spreader of it. And obviously other audience members. What did they have to say about the gun and key fob? That Dylan Rounds' friend and brother Colton Rounds went down to the trailer before the family got there, took the gun and key fob, took it to the grandparents, Larry Rounds, and then Larry kind of told them off, cleaned the items down of evidence, and then returned them back himself. Yeah, what a load of bollocks that was. But so many people were convinced by it, and it was absolutely ridiculous. I was never brainwashed by it, but I saw a range of people did. Very unfortunate to see, of course. If we just go back to Dylan's farm, we just focus in there. The parents got there first on the 30th. Noticed gun and key fob was missing. And then, as told by Justin Rounds in which the likes of Corey and some of us say that's where they got their false information source from, which was seen as the truth back then, and these delusional people probably still think it's the truth now. Justin Rounds said something completely different early on, though. Justin said in the East Idaho News official interview with Candice Cooley that once Dylan's friend got down to the area of Dylan's farm, they went into the trailer and said, oh look, there's the gun and key fob. They didn't know that they were missing to begin with. The family did, the parents did. But as soon as the brother of Dylan and the friend of Dylan came on down, they found the gun and key fob inside of the trailer, whilst the family were already down there earlier on, before them. So obviously they weren't responsible for taking it. Brenner, likely. And when that was highlighted for some time, that it was James Brenner that took the gun and key fob off Dylan Rounds, a lot of people couldn't comprehend or understand, maybe some in denial. But I think with the recent news, what we heard, the cause of death of Dylan Rounds, and supposedly the firearm, which was Dylan's used against him by Brenner, would reinforce more the idea that the gun and key fob were taken by Brenner in the first place. If the gun of Dylan's was used against him by Brenner, well, Brenner already took the gun off Dylan, so it was stolen. And the key fob as well, well, if Brenner's going to take the boots off Dylan, if Brenner is going to possibly take the wallet and already the firearm, why not the key fob as well? Because it could come in handy on the day of the 28th. Just remember that Dylan Rounds' phone ping when in possession of the killer Brenner later on in the day, still in the morning time, after 7:43 a.m, finally making his way down to Dylan's farm, as you see on screen. Dylan's phone pinged, and in this position, this spot of Dylan's farm, for about 30 minutes, and then returned back at around 8:03 a.m. back at Brenner's trailer. So Brenner likely came on down to Dylan's farm once he killed Dylan to look around. Why not? No one's going to stop him. Definitely not Dylan. Brenner looking for items to steal or use as an opportunity in disposing of Dylan, possibly, such as the pickup truck. Instead of Brenner using his own truck and getting blood on his own truck, use Dylan's. Maybe even looking inside of the trailer. Who knows? So, to be honest, if Dylan has got the key fob on him, because whether it's the direct key fob which is used on the grain truck as well, who knows, or a spare key, that Brenner took that from Dylan and then went down to the farm. Because if you think about it, you'd be thinking, right, there's a property here, it could be locked up, but you know what, I've just taken someone out, they have keys on them, a key fob, well, I'll take that, and what do I do with them? Well, I go to that property and I use them. There's no point going to a property if you know you haven't got the access and the means to the location. In Brenner's situation, he's taken out the property owner, if you want to call it that, so no one's going to stop him, and he's also got the access to it, the key fob. He's already got the gun, Brenner, so what's stopping him? Nothing. and the phone ping being proven to be down there at the time when Brenner was in possession of it after Dylan's death. So Brenner went down to the farm, looked around, and did what he needed. Maybe possibly checking the pickup truck as well, inside, for whatever reason. Used on the spot, who knows. As I said, a few unanswered questions there. Let me zoom on out. That's Don's place, in case you were wondering. I don't know if we'll need to refer to that in this video here. But yeah, at 8:03, Brenner making it back to his trailer. Then what did he do? Not much, really. It was at 3:51 p.m, much later in the day, when Brenner then decided to dispose of Dylan's phone on the route, the journey to Don Hatley's place, as you see here, which is a bit further away from the area and further from Losing Pond, but it's in the same direction. And if you go in a certain direction, you also pass by the burial site where Brenner could have disposed of Dylan on the same exact day, providing he had enough time in between to dispose of the things bit by bit. Okay? Don Hatley's place here, I should have said. I think I didn't switch quick enough when I was talking. Don Hatley's place here, as you can see. No longer available, but was. Just that grey shack still remains on site. Everything else was moved on. So, I just wanted to use this imagery for a change, kind of like mapping it out, different type of analysis, because it's like flyby footage. But so people could be asking, well, if it's somewhat reinforced, and like with what Weezer has said about at least a month ago, Justin and a friend of Justin knew about Dylan's firearm being used against himself and Brenner taking it. There's two questions. One, how did Brenner get a hold of it, first of all? And two, why was it identified in the time-lapse footage? Right? If we go here, first of all. Do you know what? Just whilst we narrate, I'll just hover over to the grain shed properties just so you've got something different to look at for once. Whether it be inside or just on the outside, how would Brenner get a hold of Dylan's firearm? One of two things. Either Dylan Rounds had his firearm inside of the grain truck when he was on the way down, and if that was the case, if Brenner got into a bit of a scrap or fight with Dylan, pushing him away, get into the grain truck to get the gun. But to be honest, Brenner would need to have an indication, some kind of knowledge, a hint, a prompt to know that Dylan Rounds was armed at the time and that Brenner could use that as an opportunity against Dylan. If there was no visible sign that Dylan was armed at the time, how would Brenner know that Dylan's armed then? He wouldn't. And maybe Brenner could search about, but in that moment, if there was a fight and a dispute, I don't think Brenner would have time. So then you could say, well, that counterpoint, then likely Brenner was armed himself. Brenner had firearms with him at the time, very likely. Well, yeah, obviously, because when it comes to like the black powder, the ignition caps and the 2 to 3 firearms, the 22 caliber rifle, they were passed on to his friend Don Hatley after Dylan's death, and when the police started sniffing about because Brenner didn't want to be seen with those items because he's a felon and he's not allowed to be in possession of firearms, he would get in trouble. And he obviously did, but back then he tried passing on the blame to someone else, which was Don, so he could save himself. So there's that to take in mind. Brenner very likely armed at the time on the 28th when Dylan Rounds was already down there. So you could say, well, Brenner just simply shot Dylan with his own firearm. But from what Weezer is saying, that Justin Rounds and a friend of Justin know about Brenner using Dylan's firearm against him, that is interesting, isn't it? Has it been mentioned in the court appearance or the court statement or by Box Elder? No. Has it been mentioned by the public? Has it been mentioned by the family publicly? No. So I do understand if people are a bit skeptical regarding the exact firearm used. Was it Dylan's? Was it Brenner's? It's one or the other, right? From what Weezer's heard, it was Dylan's. That's interesting. Would it be a surprise? No. I mean, what came first? Brenner being mad, triggered, then taking it out on Dylan, and in the process coming across Dylan's firearm, then using it against Dylan. Or Brenner being a bit frustrated, talking with Dylan, noticing that Dylan's got a firearm, Brenner wanted it and tried fighting over it. Right, different ways about it, different possibilities. Zoom in for a second. I'll just give you my idea, my concept of what could have happened, okay? Dylan, grain truck, grain shed, didn't quite go to plan, possibly because of the horse gate. As you see here, if it was closed, considering the one on the left is damaged, propped up, it's not fixed in place like this one here, so likely was damaged. That's a possibility. Some people could say that maybe, yeah, it was damaged, but way back in the past and it's got nothing to do with Dylan. But from what Brenner said to Justin Rounds on the 30th onwards, when family got down there and were questioning, wondering what was happening, Brenner said on the day Dylan did reverse into the gate. Now, obviously, Brenner has lied other times and hasn't told the story exactly truthfully. So what does it? So does it mean to say that this one's truthful or not? I mean, there might be a bit of truth in it, because Brenner has lied, but he's also told stories which are somewhat true, but not the full story. So it can vary. And, you know, well, we can have a go at Brenner. I mean, Kurt Wadsworth's been a bit on and off in the past when it came to reporting on stuff and highlighting things that happened or didn't happen, right? It was interesting, of course, in the past when Kurt Wadsworth defended Brenner and said, nope, Brenner's 100% innocent. Well, either Kurt Wadsworth's a bit delusional or he doesn't truly know his friend that well. I wonder what Kurt Wadsworth thinks nowadays of Brenner. I wonder what his reaction was. Disappointed, angry, confused, shocked? I wonder. But that can be a future discussion possibly. So, my thoughts, my ideas. Once the grain truck created a noise, commotion, Brenner came out of his trailer, confronted Dylan, and that's when it all kicked off. Whether Dylan Rounds said anything to further aggravate Brenner, whatever, Brenner taking it out on Dylan. There's claims that it was a bit of a tussle and it was up close. Well, if Brenner was unarmed at that moment, I would understand Brenner closing the distance with Dylan. Maybe punching, grabbing, pulling. But in that moment, was Dylan Rounds armed? Was the firearm on Dylan Rounds at that moment? Maybe. Would Dylan Rounds, or did Dylan Rounds have a chance to use it against Brenner? Would he ever do that? Part of me thinks probably not. Dylan doesn't seem like that type of person. But Brenner, on the other hand, does. If Brenner caught a glimpse that Dylan was armed, that might have been the prompt for Brenner to reach for it immediately or in the tussle, grabbing it, pulling it out the holster, pointing it at Dylan's head and firing the shot multiple times. If I had to truly envision it, it might sound bad, but like you think of the Western Wild West cowboy movies where two cowboys are tussling, clenching, grabbing one another, rolling in the dirt. One's unarmed, the other one's armed. The unarmed guy is on the floor whilst the other's got top position. The unarmed guy just suddenly reaches, grabs for the left or right holster of the cowboy, pulls out the firearm and uses it against them and fires the shot in the head. And then the person just falls, rolls over. That would have been close and personal, right? And as well, if someone's on top of you and you shoot them, that blood and the gravity is going to drip down and pour all over you. So that would explain the amount of blood that was on Brenner's arms, hands and sleeves, shirt. Granted, Brenner could have got that through blood being smeared on him when he was possibly dragging Dylan's body into the grain shed or out of like direct sight possibly. So there's that to take in mind, okay? Now, if that all happened and truly Dylan Rounds' firearm was used against him by Brenner, we know it's confirmed Dylan was shot, but if Dylan's actual firearm was used against him, that could well be the firearm, what you see in the time-lapse footage at 7:27 a.m. in the morning when Brenner was cleaning a firearm. That firearm could have well been Dylan Rounds, the same one that was used against Dylan before that, as Justin 1 month ago, and a friend of Justin had confirmed, let's say, from what Weezer is saying. That is very interesting. That I think it was heavily underestimated that time-lapse footage in terms of Brenner cleaning that firearm. Not enough people said that that firearm probably was the murder weapon. I did. I thought it was. And likely it is. Because, call it a coincidence or what, but it just seems a bit more than that Dylan's been shot, and shortly afterwards Brenner's got blood on him from Dylan, and that Brenner is cleaning a firearm. Well, if it's been truly confirmed that Dylan was shot multiple times, and you see Brenner holding a gun in that footage shortly afterwards, likely, seems obvious, that gun was used against Dylan. The question is, was that gun identified in the footage? No. When Candice Cooley, Justin Rounds, like a year ago now, 2023, roughly, March, when the family heard about Brenner being charged originally with the aggravated murder of Dylan and the desecration. That's changed since, as I said earlier on in this video. But at the time, that was partially because of the turning point, the catalyst in the evidence being found at Dylan's phone with footage on it being retrieved through that forensic dive. And that was retrieved in November 2022, which showed Brenner in his trailer, with the timestamps in line with Dylan's death and the possession of Dylan's phone then being in possession by Brenner, the killer, as we've seen since. So it all ties in line there if you're doing it as like a timeline, so it makes sense. At least it does for me. Let me know what you think. But when Justin Rounds and even Candice Cooley were describing the footage, none of them said, oh yeah, and in that footage, Brenner was cleaning a gun, which was Dylan's or looked like Dylan's. They never mentioned that. Maybe they didn't know at the time. They didn't see it that way. Things might have changed since. But if Justin Rounds and a friend of Justin know, just click that off. If Justin Rounds and the friend of Justin know that Brenner used Dylan's firearm against Dylan, then how would they know? An autopsy report can prove that someone was shot, maybe even the caliber, possibly. But you can't just suddenly say, well, because we know that, now we know that Dylan's gun was used against him. No. You'd have to find the firearm, the murder weapon, if it just so happened to be Dylan's, match the bullet and the description, possibly in the caliber, and the fingerprints and DNA too, so it all traces back to that firearm and to whom was in possession of it at the time of the murder. And you don't have that complete picture. You got the time-lapse footage, which may be clear or may not, depends how good the quality is of a firearm being cleaned. Maybe that was the only piece of evidence that could be used to match the autopsy report somehow. Incriminating evidence of Brenner holding a gun and cleaning it, and then later proof and evidence of the autopsy that Dylan was shot. So that firearm in that time-lapse must be used in the murder of Dylan. But how can you identify that firearm in the time-lapse belonging to Dylan, though, if they couldn't identify it really early on, such as the family? Why did the family know it now, but they didn't back then? There must be another factor element along the way to prove it. Oh, maybe because the firearm was found in recent time. Well, if it was found in recent time or so, that firearm can't be Dylan's, because Dylan's firearm that was originally missing was returned back the 1st or the 2nd of June, really early on in the case, a few days after Dylan's murder, right? If there's been developments ever since, it would be more so along the lines of a different firearm has been found, and it would be very unlikely to be Dylan's. It would be probably Brenner's if it was found buried, the murder weapon. So it seems like there's been a big delay. Though, the order of events, it just seems to link personally, right? So if we knew, and it was confirmed way back at the start, that Dylan was shot multiple times by Brenner, and we also knew early on that the time-lapse footage linked on to just after Dylan's death, post-death of Brenner cleaning himself down and the firearm used in the murder of Dylan, and then we heard about the family acknowledging that Dylan's firearm was missing from his property, and maybe from Dylan himself as well. And then shortly afterwards you hear about it being returned back, the firearm, but the problem is it's being cleaned down. Then you look back to the time-lapse footage of Brenner cleaning down a firearm, wiping it off evidence. Yeah, it seems to link, doesn't it? Firearm taken away from Dylan's possession, later returned back, wiped clean down of evidence and DNA. And there was actual footage of Brenner cleaning a firearm on the same day, likely the day when Dylan's firearm was taken from him, and then a few days later returned back to Dylan's place. It just seems to link awfully well. I want to know your thoughts on the matter. Feel free to share this video so more people can see and read and hear about it. If there's any more breaking news or updates that can be provided. I just wanted to incorporate what we've known in the past and times of uncertainty, and reinforce it with the evidence and proof that's come out in recent time. There's still questions that can be highlighted, of course, but I think we're clearing up things as we go along. Maybe the next video that I could consider possibly maybe the jewelry truck, and does it have any link or appliance to the likes of the burial site? I'll put that in perspective and give you my thoughts on the matter, okay? Might even debunk it with a form of common sense. Be on the lookout for that video. That'll come maybe tomorrow or the day later. Thanks for watching. For now, goodbye, good night.